Hey everyone, this lecture is about language and literature. This one's section 2, and we're talking about basically what are the literary responses to World War One. Sorry if this video is a little bit long. There's a lot of material to get through, so if you need to, you can pause, stop, rewind, or whatever. But this is all about section 2. I know it's a lot of stuff to read, so hopefully by lecturing it, it's a little bit easier for you to comprehend. So first of all, this part is about two things. One, the literary response to World War One, and also something called modernism, which we'll talk about later. So before we can even talk about the response to World War One, you should know how World War One started. We'll talk about this many times, but let's review real quick what started it all. First of all, in the late 19th century, Europe was basically having a rise of nationalism, which is what you see here. So all these countries that were in Europe, all of a sudden everyone got proud of their own country. Germany, which is kind of led by General Otto von Bismarck. He took over Germany and he unified it and made it very militaristic and wanting to take over the world. The term that he uses, that's right here, it's called Weltpolitik, means world policy. So he had a very belligerent, I'm going to take over the world type policy. That plus the rise of nationalism kind of started this whole World War One thing. The reason why it technically all started, or why people say, this is what happened, was on June 28, 1914, a Slavic nationalist, his name is Gavrilo Princip. So think of the name Princip. He wanted to liberate Serbia from Austro-Hungarian control. And what happened is that he shot the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. He assassinated them. And Princip actually ended up being a member of a secret society called the Black Hand. And they targeted this people because they wanted to basically assert their power into Austro-Hungarian control. So that kind of also led to a cultural shift. Pre-World War One, they call it a static world, where everything was kind of, if you want to think about it this way, didn't really change. Like there was a belief in absolutism and traditionalism. Relationships were stable, things were permanent, reliable. Everyone was kind of innocent. It was, it wasn't a perfect world, but everything was kind of predictable. But after World War One, now all of a sudden morals are kind of shaking. Like who do you pledge your allegiance to, kind of deal. Whatever the social norms are and beliefs were changed. Everything was unstable, from economics to society to classes, and this innocence, quote unquote innocence, was lost, meaning that everyone was exposed to the war, exposed to real life. So I'm going to have you watch this quick, short video on the outbreak of World War I. It's about 2-3 minutes, so just bear with me and listen to this.
Austria-Hungary and Germany were allied against the other great power bloc, Russia and France. War between Austria and Serbia would mean war between Austria and Russia. That would mean war between Russia and Germany. That would mean war between Germany and France. And that might mean war between Germany and Britain. Over a few days in early August 1914, the nations of Europe fell into war. August the 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. August the 3rd, Germany declared war on France, deciding to invade her old enemy through the neutral country of Belgium. The Germans faced the problem of a war on two fronts. In the east against Russia, and in the west against France. Some years before war broke out, they had devised a plan to deal with this, the Schlieffen Plan. It was a brave gamble. They calculated that Russia would be slow to get its forces together, so this would give them a few weeks to defeat France. They would attack through Belgium to avoid French defences and be in Paris in 3 weeks. that way France would be defeated, and they could turn all their forces to deal with the huge Russian army. The Germans didn't expect Britain to get involved. Britain had a treaty to protect Belgium, but this was signed way back in 1839. The Kaiser didn't think Britain would go to war over a scrap of paper. In any case, compared to Germany, he felt Britain had a contemptibly little army.
So that's basically how World War I broke out. A couple of things that you also need to know about the war that relate to this literary responses is something called trench warfare. I'm sure pretty much all of you know about trenches. It was basically a major development in the war, and many of the conflicts were fought, quote-unquote, in the trenches. They were well planned and strategically placed. Some people think of trenches, they think of just one big pit. But as you see in this diagram, we have one big pit with all these little tunnels. Here's a support trench. Behind that, there's a reserve trench. So it's a little bit more detailed than just like a simple pit in the ground. And then this space right here was called no man's land, which is the space between one's front line and the enemy's front line. And they also use barbed wire in between it. Again, they call it no man's land. This warfare kind of lengthened World War I because of the way the trenches worked. It was hard for countries to win since both sides used them. So it ended up being like a lot of the war became ties. But what ended up happening is that armored tanks were eventually constructed and used, and then trenches were no longer like useful or helpful or anything like that. So very important to know what trenches are. So now we're going to talk about the literary responses to the war. So first of all, this one's William Strang, okay, and this is This is William Strang's painting of Thomas Hardy, and this is Thomas Hardy's poem. Okay, the poem is called Channel Firing. Again, remember the name Thomas Hardy. It preceded the war by 5 months, so it's actually kind of fun, not funny, but it's kind of interesting that he wrote this before the war even started. So he wrote, "That night your great guns unaware shook all our coffins as we lay, and broke the chancel window squares. We thought it was the judgment day." So this one was basically a poem that talked about how close the guns were to everybody that was, even though people weren't in the war, they could hear the guns and all the fire. And it felt like judgment day for everybody that was, even those that were at home. So another poem, this one's called In Flanders Fields by John McCrae, who is British. And it kind of reflects the deep patriotic mission of fighting. So they talked about Britain fighting because it was patriotic. And they talked about poppies, the flower poppies, as a dual symbol. One, the poppies represented the blood of soldiers, since the poppies had this bright red, so they symbolize as blood. But also represents, as a flower, it also represents hope, or the hope of spring. So just know that organizations like Veterans of Foreign Wars still use poppies to memorialize it. And I'm going to play this video for you so you can hear the poem and also see the imagery that go with In Flanders Fields.
Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
So very important to know the symbolism, the poem In Flanders Fields, John McCrae, the poet, also from Britain. So there's different kinds of literary responses, different kinds of patriotism. So again, as I talked about in very many of the other subjects, we're going to talk about a lot of different names. So try to understand all these names as much as you can. The first person here on the left, Rupert Brooke, he wrote The Soldier. In The Soldier, he talks about a deep sense of patriotism for England. It contains very, very vivid imagery of the battlefield grave, and he contended that it made the corner of a foreign field English soil. So basically, he was very patriotic to England. His response, or I know there's these weird cartoon bubbles, but war is kind of cool. Okay, because we're being patriotic. We love England. That's why we're going to war. Wilfred Owen, on the other hand, his poem is actually a little bit darker. It's called Dulce et decorum est. It memorializes the horror of men that were wounded and dying from gas attacks. So the poem actually describes a soldier like slowly dying, suffocating from the gas as it eats away at his lungs. So talk about the horror of death and injury and describing them dying from poison gas. So here, Owen kind of tells the readers what the reality of war is. It's not so patriotic or so great that Rupert Brooke was talking about. Sadly, he was Wilfred Owen. He was killed in action in August 1918, 3 months before the armistice was signed and the war ended. Some more guys. Let's start here on the right. Robert Graves. He was a poet that lived up to age 90, but he was so injured in war that he actually died. His poetry, he uses poetry to challenge people's attitudes about the war. Kind of like Owen's poetry, it showed the ugly reality of what war really was. The lines come from this one called "The Trenches Heard in Ranks." It says, "Seams rather of a grayback shirt, and we're the little lice." So in this poem, The Trenches, there's a couple of imagery that you need to know. First of all, he uses the term lice. He considers soldiers to be like lice, meaning that they could be squashed in the blink of an eye. And he also uses this term grayback, which means the military attire for Britain was the standard uniform was a grayback shirt. The next one was Siegfried Sassoon. He was actually friends with Owen and Graves, and they all wrote very dark poetry. First, he used to write patriotic pieces like gosh, now I forgot his name. Like the first person that we talked about, he was very Rupert Brooke, very patriotic. His first pieces were very patriotic, but then Sassoon eventually he published a protest against the war in something called The Times. He actually could have been court-martialed for being anti-patriotic, but he was examined by a medical board and he was considered a victim of shell shock, so he didn't have to be court-martialed. So that's where he would write some of his work. Was in a military hospital. And here's from one of his poems, Trench Duty. "Starlight overhead, blank stars, I'm wide awake, and some chap's dead." So again, all of these three guys were very dark, imagery-driven poets. One of the more famous works that you may have heard of is called All Quiet on the Western Front. It actually was written by a German, and that German, his name is Erich Maria Remarque, and he wrote this All Quiet on the Western Front. So here it is, written by Erich Maria Remarque. The actual book was talking about a protagonist. His name was Paul Baumer. And a school teacher urges him, hey, you should join the war. You should enlist and fight for the country. But apparently the protagonist in this novel eventually becomes disillusioned from the war and, gets in his own way, gets sad about the war. The author himself was wounded in battle and spent most of the war in an army hospital and didn't write the novel until 9 years later. The book's English version was well received, but the Germans actually didn't like his work because it made war seem not glorious, not heroic, not good. So the Germans actually didn't like his work. And by 1933, he earned the ire of Nazis. Nazi officials really, really hated his work for saying that war is bad or whatever. All Quiet on the Western Front, it means nothing new in the West. It was first published in 1928 and then released in America in 1930. And again, explores the theme of disillusionment with the war. The film was great. It was awarded Oscars for Best Director and Best Picture. It was also nominated but did not win Best Cinematography and Best Writing. So all quite on the Western Front, something very important you need to know. The next piece that you need to know is women in the war. So women in the war, how did it affect them? How did they relate, especially those that were in the literary? How did the females respond to this? We'll watch another quick video.
When the U.S. entered the war, the country suddenly needed large numbers of women as much as it needed soldiers. Whereas men were needed to fight in the trenches, women were needed as nurses, as translators, stenographers, cooks, and switchboard operators. Supplying the army with uniforms called for thousands of seamstresses. Women enrolled in the Army, Navy, and even the Marines. Nurses volunteered in the Red Cross and YMCA. Sources report that nearly 20,000 Red Cross nurses served with the Army and Navy nurse corps, half of them overseas. Female Salvation Army volunteers worked as nurses and at frontline canteens serving hot meals, donuts, and coffee to soldiers. Ordinary girls in towns all over America suddenly had a chance at a different life and the prospect of traveling to Europe to be an important part of the war effort. Among the thousands of women volunteering in France were many daughters of privilege, the daughters of the wealthy society class. Girls in elite women's institutions like Smith College often volunteered together. Newspapers like Stars and Stripes played up the society girls with bold headlines. Heiress scrubs tubs to aid U.S. A February 1918 headline read, Society girl wields brush and soap as her war weapons. The newspaper stories about rich girl volunteers were propaganda for sure, but also true. They weren't allowed to fight like their brothers in the Lafayette Escadrille, but the war gave them a chance for a bigger life. An Army head nurse wrote, Some of the most conscientious and hardest workers in my unit are girls who had done nothing all their lives but fritter away their time in society. The war woke them up. They were girls of good education, but they had never thought much about the stern realities of life until America got into the war and they suddenly saw a chance to do something useful.
So this can be a very great essay question for the decathlon. Like, how did World War I affect women? And it impacted them a lot. As you can see, a lot of them had to travel as battlefield nurses. They had to serve different needs, whether it was the uniform or stenographers. So they weren't, every time we talk about the war, we only talk about men. Women were affected as well. Women and their families, also with guys gone, they suffered more displacement, famine, starvation, even high death rates during childbirth. And also, as I mentioned earlier, since the battles weren't so far from home, some were endangered or hurt from mortar shells or shrapnel from the war. So here's some women that we're going to talk about in terms of their literary responses to the World War I. British women were in a unique position of being kind of in the center of the action, even though they weren't in the war. So the first one we're going to talk about is Rebecca West. Okay, she focused on the home front rather than the battlefront. In 1916, she wrote an article for the Daily Chronicle. It was called Hands That War. And it was about this munitions factory. And she's kind of like a fairy tale-like descriptions to convey these very dangerous conditions in which women worked in to support the war. So these are fake quotes, but it says, I'm so much more than this awesome headdress that I'm wearing. Haha. And then again, her whole piece that she wrote about was basically talking about the dangerous conditions in which women worked, basically because of the war. The girl on the right, her name is Catherine Mansfield, and she visited the war zone in 1915 after her brother had passed away or was killed during the battle. She had a short story called The Fly, and it was a satire about the unimportance of human life. And it describes a man who basically is grieving because his son was lost in the war and decides to torture a fly. So basically, her piece was a satire saying like, oh, human life's not really that important after she went to the battlefield. So another video for you all. This one is by Gertrude Stein. And she was a critical figure in World War I too. She lived most of her life in Paris as an expat, and she was very eccentric. She was a good writer. She was a patron of the arts, and she also did this with Alice Toklas. During the war, both of them ordered a Ford truck from the U.S. to deliver medical supplies to French hospitals. And then after the armistice, the two women visited the French battlefields, and Stein herself said it was so terrifying. So she also was one of the people that actually went to the battlefield. So we'll watch a quick video about this.
Gertrude Stein came to Paris in 1903 to join her brothers Leo and Michael. As the Stein family built up the world's first collection of modern art, Gertrude began to write in earnest.
Gertrude Stein, rich in enthusiasm but modest in means, and then about as unknown as a writer as Picasso was as a painter, began her famous and eclectic Picasso collection. For her first Picasso, she and her brother Leo paid 150 francs, and all three quarreled about the picture's merits. It was an early, exquisite, conventional nude. Miss Stein, who was already ripe to prefer stranger sights in art, thought the girl looked classically flat-footed. From 1906 to 1909, the Stein family controlled the Picasso output, since no one else wanted it. Janet Flanner, an American in Paris.
As Gertrude and Leo's collection grew, people called at 27 Rue de Fleury to see the curious paintings. These gatherings developed into an informal Saturday night salon, at which Matisse and Picasso were frequent guests. Picasso, in particular, loved the international flavor and sexual ambiguity of the evenings. Then, in 1907, Gertrude Stein met Alice B. Toklas.
So it gets cut off here, but you should know that Stein, also, I forgot to mention it, emphasize it, but she was kind of partly credited with helping Picasso become like a star. And then this person, Alice Toklas, they don't really talk so much about her. You should know that she's actually like a longtime lover and partner of Gertrude Stein. So they kind of were grouped together since they were partners. Because there was so much death and destruction, there was also a lot of writings that mentioned God, especially from females. This one is a poem from Dame Edith Sitwell, and this was actually inspired by the Battle of Somme in 1916. You might not remember the Battle of Somme. We'll talk about it when we get to the history section, but you should know it was the bloodiest, or considered one of the bloodiest operations in history. Sitwell, she actually talks about how ironic that a good God makes it possible for those at home to keep on dancing, even though there are people dying in battle. So it says here, the floors are slippery with blood, the world gyrates too. God is good, that while his wind blows out the light for those who hourly die for us, we still can dance each night. So again, it's kind of a weird, to me personally, kind of a weird poem, but they're talking about that God makes it possible for them to be okay and to dance at home while people are dying. So there's that. And then there's another person, I don't have a slide for this, but there's another German poet. Her name is Frieda Schanz, and she talks about God as well. Her poem is called Silence, and she talks about, she wrote this one line, one spirit, one God, one will of primeval strength marks the beat in the hall of breathless silence. So just know that there are women that also talk about God in their poetry. So here's another woman. We'll talk about Vera Brittain. So all of the writers we've talked about so far have like suffered losses and used their grief kind of constructively. Another person that's like that is Vera Brittain, a British writer, who sadly, because of the World War, her fiance and brother were killed. Her fiance was called Roland Lytton, and he was killed in 1915. She was a student at Oxford, so those of you that know the prestigious British universities, she went to Oxford University. So she left school and joined the voluntary aid detachment, like she volunteered for the war as a nurse. She then subsequently worked in English, Maltese, and French hospitals. So here it is, became a voluntary aid detachment nurse. And she recalls in her autobiography, Testament of Youth, she recalls basically the pain of losing her fiance. She wrote, "As I walked back to the station one afternoon, a red sunset turned the puddles on the road into gleaming pools of blood, and a new horror of mud and death darkened my mind with its dreadful obsession. Roland, I reflected bitterly, was now part of the corrupt clay into which war had transformed the fertile soil of France. He would never know again the smell of a wet evening in early spring." So again, a very, very tragic, very sad story by Vera Brittain. Eventually, she became a lifelong peace activist and even campaigned for the League of Nations. So that's who Vera Brittain is. Hopefully this, again, the names might not come to you, or maybe the names come to you, but hopefully these stories you're starting to remember. So now we're going to talk about kind of like the modernism piece. Although the World War One, like after World War One, offered kind of an environment for modernism to flourish. What was actually getting popular was called avant-garde. I don't know if you guys know avant-garde. It kind of reminds me of, I think of Lady Gaga, or like if you've ever seen Lady Gaga's anything, costumes, performances, that's what they call avant-garde. In 1909, Filippo Marinetti published the Futurist Manifesto, which emphasizes the uncontrollable power of modern machinery, the vastness of the modern city, and the dominance of energy and speed. So in other words, they're talking about the unstoppable power of the future. Okay, so that's kind of what was kind of popular after World War One. Unfortunately, this manifesto also captured an eerie sense that violence would also take over the world. He wrote, "We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women." So this manifesto, he talks about, even though there's uncontrollable power, he also talks about how there's going to be violence in the future. This one's, again, it's called The City Rises. Oh, this one's called The City Rises. This is an artwork, and this was by Umberto Boccioni. Though this picture was actually inspired by Filippo Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto. So here, let's talk about some more people. First one, we could talk about Ezra Pound. Here we go, Ezra Pound. He was actually against Marinetti's manifesto, and he would downplay the importance of it by claiming that he had his own thing, which is against futurism, called imagisme. I don't know how to pronounce these words, but imagisme. And his movement was nothing like the futurists. His movement was inspired by tradition, etc., etc. So here's his fake things. Imagisme rocks. I detest futurismo nonsense. My awesome trumps yours, Filippo Marinetti. So again, I know it's weird. It's kind of corny, but just trying to help you remember that there's this battle between imagism and futurism. Another person you need to know, T.E. Hulme, or Hulme. He was indifferent to futurism and imagism, but he was actually kind of a critical person in modernism. He was a philosopher, and he met Ezra Pound in 1909 and created a kind of a small body of work before he was killed in the war. But it was actually very important that his work was actually inspiration to a lot of other people in the future. So here it says, "I'm indifferent, but my awesomeness trumps both of yours." So you have Filippo Marinelli on one side with futurism, you have Ezra Pound on the other side with imagism, and you have Hulme with a indifferent, like who cares type of attitude. So just so that you know what imagism is about, you're really saying like, oh, what the heck is it about? Well, it depends on who you ask. So Hulme, he actually was credited with first defining the concept of the image in terms of literature. What does imagism mean in literature? So in 1908, he established something called the Poets Club, and they met and they shared original writing. Next year, Ezra Pound meets Hulme, and he wants to start a writing club in London, and together with someone called H.D., Hilda Doolittle, but they just call her H.D., they started making and publishing imagism or imagiste poems. So here's actually, and they wrote the poem called "In a Station of the Metro." This video, it's kind of like a slideshow. Just want you to see a video interpretation of that poem of imagism. So this is kind of like the poem, but it's not. It's a video interpretation of the poem. So yeah, there's no sound or anything, but this is the poem in picture form. So that's imagism. This one they wrote down Amygism because after a while, actually Ezra Pound distanced himself from the Imagist style. But American poet Amy Lowell arrived in Great Britain, um, and she kind of took over the movement. And according to Ezra Pound, like Amy Lowell like took it over from him. So she didn't like her version of Imagism, so that's why they called it Amygism. Because he said like, oh, you ruined Imagism, so you could have your own version called Amygism or whatever. Then came the Cubist movement. We talked about this with art. So Georges Braque, right here, Georges Braque, and Pablo Picasso were the geniuses behind the Cubist movement. So even though there was artists like Henri Matisse and Diego Rivera also creating Cubist masterpieces, they're the ones, Braque and Picasso, the ones kind of behind the Cubist movement. It was based to describe Braque's first exhibition in Paris in 1908. And one critic sort of saw his work and said like, oh, they're just paintings constructed of little cubes. So this style really incorporates radical color, radical shape, distilling, like getting rid of landscapes and geometric forms. This Cubist era actually informally ended right around the time that World War I began, so it kind of overlapped with post-impressionism. So here's some of the works of Cubism. Here's Diego Rivera, here's Picasso, and this is Braque. And then we talked about something called little magazines. Around the time modernism started to become into its own, something called little magazines appeared. These little magazines were small literary journals, and they highlighted work that was in the rapidly changing cultural scene. So anything that was happening culturally, that's what little magazines, these little journals, were about. Some of the most notable journals, the New Age, the English Review, Poetry, the Little Review, Blast, Wheels, Transatlantic Review, Transition. So it's hard to remember all of these magazines, but just know that these are the names of it. And again, they highlight the work in rapidly changing culture. So here's kind of an excerpt from it. It is a queer and fantastic world. Why can't people have what they want? The things were all there to content everybody, yet everybody has got the wrong thing. Perhaps you can make a head or tail of it. It is beyond me. And this was published in the English Review called The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. Ford Madox Ford. That is little magazines. And the last, I think this is, we've got 2 more slides left. So the importance of literary review was, it was a powerful source of social and political commentary, particularly about the war. So there wasn't really a place for people to have commentary about the war. There was no blogs or Twitter. They had literary review. So these little magazines had taken the world by storm because they had all the war commentary. And then there was famous poets that were in these literary reviews: Yeats, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Carl Sandburg, people you may have heard of. So that's why you should know that these are very popular. Another American literary journal called The Little Review was one of the, here it is right here, The Little Review, was important to experimental writers and international art. So here are all the ones that we just talked about in the last slide. Poetry, a magazine, this was had the most longevity, that was out the longest and lasted the longest, so that you know what some of these little journals are. And the last slide, again, sorry this is a very long presentation. And then the war's effect on modernism. Okay, so in some ways the World War kind of represented everything that the avant-garde movement stood for. So we're talking about radicalism, radical change, shock, a shift in power that kind of like mirrors the art of the avant-garde. So not only did people think that movement kind of invited war, but it was also for artists. It was also impossible for artists to represent what they couldn't understand. On the other hand, World War I forced artists and writers to. So here you go. The Great War or World War I both represented and stifled the avant-garde movement. So on the other hand, World War I sort of forced artists artists and writers to reevaluate about what culture really is. One historian, as you may have read, Samuel Hines, thought that the post-war modernism was probably the most important cultural change in English history. So in other words, rather than just, instead of avant-garde kind of dying, avant-gardism kind of evolved into modernism. And this time it was mixed in with a deep sense of loss and disenchantment with human civilization. The major modernists are English Ernest Hemingway, and included people what they call the lost, quote unquote, the lost generation, and they would turn traditionalists like Robert Graves and Sigrid Sassoon, that those people that we just talked about, that traditionalism like kind of changed them. When Hemingway arrived in Paris in 1921, like after World War I, he was kind of the right place at the right time. So we got the people that are avant-garde, modernism, this new radical change, versus people that are traditionalists like Ezra Pound. So again, sorry for the long video. I know we're getting close to 30, 40 minutes, but again, a lot of information that I want you to understand for Decathlon. If you have any questions, let me know. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see y'all later.